Hey guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. Today's video is going to be a very mysterious one, and I think this case is so interesting, so I really hope that you guys enjoy it. And with that all being said, let's get right into today's video. This all started on August 20th, 1966, when a teenage boy was out on the hillside in Niterói, which is a suburb in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This young boy, he was about 18 years old, and he was out there just flying a kite, hanging out, but at one point his kite had ended up getting away from him, so he was chasing it, trying to track this kite down. And that is when he ended up on Vitem Hill, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and once he was on this hill, he was really taken back by a super foul odor. Following the stench, the boy continued to kind of search the area looking for his kite, but to his horror, instead of discovering his kite, he discovered the two bodies of these two men that were now deceased. Now, both of these men were wearing suits, and they were wearing raincoats on top of those suits, and their bodies were laying on like a set up bed of leaves in a clearing type area on that hill. Now, the scene itself, when the boy came upon it, was said to be quite strange. There were no signs of foul play or anything like that, but both men had their hands behind their head, like this, as if they were just laying down peacefully about to take a nap or just relax and hang out with their buddy. It just didn't look like there was any foul play or like anything criminal had even happened here. There was just these two bodies out there laying on the hill. Immediately after finding these bodies, the boy ran into town and he went straight to the police station and informed police of what he had just discovered. But it was now nighttime and the weather was getting really bad, so the police decided that it was in their best interest to not visit the scene until the following morning. I briefly already touched on what exactly the scene looked like, but the next day when police arrived to the scene, they found the two men's bodies. Again, both men were wearing suits, and on top of those suits they were wearing raincoats, and there was no sign of foul play. There was no blood or anything like that at the scene, and both men looked like they were just laying down relaxing. There was no sign that they were in any kind of distress or anything like that. It looked as if they had passed away pretty peacefully. Both men's bodies were laying on this bed of leaves, and all of the leaves that the men were laying on looked as if they had been cut by a knife and then laid out specifically like that for the men to lay on. On top of that, the bodies were already decomposing, but at the scene they had found next to the men a book, an empty water bottle, and then either a bag or it was described as a package that was laying next to the two men that had two wet towels inside of it. Now, to make this all even more strange, and what really got people going about this case and what really gets this case its name and the attention that it gets, is that along with all of these belongings that the men had with them, they also had two lead masks that were made just cut out to cover the men's eyes. These lead masks appeared to be homemade and looked as if they were just simply cut out of a sheet of metal. When police arrived at the scene, again, the men had this little like notebook that was sitting beside them, and this notebook had about 3 pages inside of it that had been written on. And what was written inside of this notebook seems very cryptic and hard to follow, so I'm just going to be reading that to you guys right now. On one page of the notebook, it listed a list of alphanumerical codes and instructions reading 1630, the specified location, 1830, ingest capsules, after effects, protect metal, await signal, mask. On another note that the men had in their pockets, it read, Sunday, 1 tablet after the meal. Monday, 1 tablet in the morning on a fast. Tuesday, 1 tablet after the meal. Wednesday, 1 tablet before laying down. This particular note was interesting because it was determined that both of the men had actually passed away on Wednesday, August 17th, 1966. Which obviously just seems a little bit strange considering that the last thing that was written in this notebook was to take a pill on Wednesday before they went to sleep. Both of these men had ID on them, which made it very easy for police to identify them as Manuel de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viena. Both men were electrical repair technicians, and they worked in a city and lived in a city 200 kilometers away from where they were found, which leads to another question. Why were these men even in Rio de Janeiro? Something else to note here, that neither of the men had any kind of money on them when their bodies were discovered. Once police got to the scene, they then sent both of the men's bodies to the local coroner's office. However, at this time, the coroner's office was very, very busy and they were super overworked and very behind. So because of this, the bodies were not examined for several weeks following the discovery of them. By the time the coroner actually got around to examining both of the men's bodies, both of their internal organs were already so decomposed that you couldn't identify anything that could have been digested or anything that could have led to the men's death. It was, however, determined that there was no external distress done to either of the men. That would include burns or anything along those lines. There was nothing like that. So it was later determined that both men had passed away due to cardiac arrest due to unknown causes. Something that I thought was super interesting about this case is even though the men's bodies were out in the wild for several days, in that time, neither of the bodies had even been touched by any of the wildlife that was in that area. And obviously, being the wild in Brazil, there are several other kinds of animals out there that would love to feast, I guess, on a human body that was decomposing, or any body that's decomposing, and that didn't happen in this case at all, which is obviously very, very rare and does seem quite strange. After getting this amount of information that I already shared with you, police went into town and started questioning the people who were in that area at that time, and it turned out that several people that day had come into contact with Manuel and Miguel while they were in the area, and because of that, the police were able to put together a series of events that had taken place up to the period of the man's deaths. On August 17th, which ended up being the determined day for both of these men's passing, Manuel and Miguel also told their families that they were going to San Paulo to pick up some electrical items, and along with that, they would be purchasing a used car. They had about $1,000 on them, which is a fair amount of money even today, but especially back then, and especially for in Brazil. The two men were dropped off at a bus station by a friend, and that is when they were believed to travel by bus from Campos, which is where they live, to Niterói. And this would be later confirmed because Miguel actually ran into his nephew while they were at the bus station, and that is when he told his nephew that he would be going to Niterói to purchase a used vehicle. The nephew thought this was odd and ended up telling Miguel that he believed that it would have been much cheaper for the two men to purchase a used car in their hometown rather than traveling to the big city. However, to this, Miguel responded that going to the city, the main purpose of this trip was not to purchase a used car, but that when he returned home, he would then tell his nephew if he believed in spiritualism. And then after this conversation, the two just went their separate ways. Around 2:30 p.m., that is when the bus arrived in Niterói with both men on it. The men got off and then they went and visited an electrical store where they never ended up purchasing anything. However, they were found with receipts on their bodies that did suggest that the men had bought the raincoats after they got to Niterói that day, and then they went to a bar where they purchased a bottle of water. The staff at this bar was questioned, and the woman who was working at that time, the waitress, ended up saying that she did remember both men and that they both seemed extremely irritated and agitated and on edge at the time that she was serving them. Both men were last seen alive in a Jeep driving with two other men. The destination for this is unknown, but it is believed to have been Vitem Hill. And something to note here is that the two other men that were in the Jeep with Miguel and Manuel have never been identified. They've never come forward, and obviously once the men get to the hill, what exactly happened after that can only be speculated. Two men were actually seen going up the hill, and the reason that people had noted this is because at the time that the two men had gone up the hill, it was extremely stormy and windy, so people thought it was kind of strange that this would be a time that these men would decide to go on like a hike. The following day, a very young child had been playing on Vitem Hill, and he had actually come across the bodies of Manuel and Miguel. The boy was absolutely terrified, and he ran home immediately and told his parents, and his parents then went into town and they found an on-duty police officer, and they told him what their son had found, but the police officer just dismissed this as a child's imagination, so nothing was ever done about this, and this specific incident wasn't taken very seriously, and it was just pretty much brushed off. It is then speculated that the following day, maybe somebody else came across the two men's bodies and they ransacked them and robbed the bodies of everything that the men had on them. And then later on, the 18-year-old came across the bodies and he went directly to the police station and notified the police of what he had discovered. And due to the bad weather that night, the next day the police went out, and that is when the bodies and the very strange scene were discovered, and that is when all of this started to kind of link together. The strangest thing about this case is obviously the lead masks that were found with the men. Now, something to note here, and I will include pictures throughout the video, but they weren't full face like shields. They were just these little strips that covered the men's eyes, almost like sunglasses, but you couldn't see through them, obviously. Now, what exactly these sunglasses or these eye protectors were used for is completely unknown, but I do think that this is extremely strange. Now let's talk about some of the theories that go along with this case. Something that I do just want to mention quickly, however, is that lead is the material that is most commonly used to protect you against radiation poisoning. However, these were not radiation masks. Again, they only covered your eyes, whereas if you were trying to protect your head from radiation, you would want to have a mask, a whole shield around your entire head. And these masks that these men had made were not that. They were little just strips of the material that went around your head, so they wouldn't protect them from any radiation. But some of the theories in this case do revolve around that theory. They found the piece of metal that the glasses were cut from in Miguel's workshop that he normally just did average work in. He would fix TVs and electronics and things along those lines. But when they were searching his workshop, they also found a notebook that had some writing in it that talked about spirit guides and guiding spirits and masks to protect your eyes from lights or bright luminosity. Because of all of this strange stuff that was going along with the men's death, many people have speculated that maybe Miguel and Manuel were not just your average electrical technicians. Maybe they were actually very high experienced electricians, and that they were doing work for extraterrestrials or for the government, and that they had actually arranged to meet up with some extraterrestrial beings on Vitem Hill that night. This theory, it is believed that both men had been given instructions on how to do this, and it is speculated that their physical bodies stopped functioning and that their minds had been transported into some extraterrestrial afterlife, or in a more spiritual world, and they are there right now, completely fine. This may sound a little unbelievable, but there is more evidence that has been found to suggest that this could have happened. On the night of the men's death, it was reported that a few residents in that area had come forward to a local paper and reported seeing a orange orb-like object that resembled to them a flying saucer hovering over Vitem Hill on the night that the men had passed away. Another man who had spoken to police, who was very good friends with Manuel and Miguel, said that the three of them were a part of this group together that they called the spiritual scientists. And in this group, the three men had built this kind of machine that would help them get into contact with extraterrestrial beings. But this man had said that about 2 months earlier, after building this machine, it then exploded. First page of this notebook was found to be just electrical items that the men would be picking up, and things along those lines that weren't too strange, considering that the men were electricians and that they would need these things, especially in their job. So that wasn't super weird, but I do want to revisit the rest of the notebook and the other things that were written along in there, because they are, again, very cryptic and super strange. The second page of the notebook was a page that we already talked about that listed the days Sunday to Wednesday with instructions on how to take these tablets that the men would be taking, with the last note saying to take the tablet on Wednesday before bed. And to me and several other people, because they said to take this tablet before they're going to sleep, it kind of suggests almost that the men did think that they were going to survive whatever happened to them on Wednesday. The third page in the notebook was focused on afterwards, and it was written very poorly in grammar with instructions to be at a specific place at 4:30 p.m., then at 6:30 p.m. after the effects, protect the metal, wait, mask, signal. Now these messages had to be translated from Portuguese, but it is said that even before the translation, the written note doesn't make much sense at all. I did mention the third note at the beginning of the video with the numbers and whatnot. Maybe I'll go over it again quickly, but I did just want to mention that that just ended up being dismissed as Ohm's law, which is very common in the electrical community. Because of this, some people believe that these may have been instructions that the men had received from an outer dimensional being, and that they had received them through a machine that they had built to communicate with the beings. Now, what exactly these capsules contained or what they were obviously is unknown, and they never found the capsules or anything like that on the men's bodies, and due to the decomposition of both of the men's bodies when they were discovered, they weren't able to find any drugs in their system or anything like that. But it is strongly believed that whatever these capsules were, the men did end up ingesting. The metals part of the message is a little bit more confusing. It says remove metals, but some people have come to the conclusion that this could have meant removing things like jewelry, and that maybe that's what those wet towels were sitting there for. Maybe they had them wrapped up, all of their, jewelry or watches or things along those lines, wrapped up in these wet towels, but then somebody had robbed the bodies so they didn't have these things on them anymore. And then obviously the masks in the letter are most likely referring to the lead masks that were found with the men's bodies. And in this theory, obviously the masks were created to protect the men's eyes from some kind of bright light or something along those lines, and many people do believe that that bright light could have been a UFO. Obviously, in cases like this, you're always going to come across a skeptic who doesn't believe the theory that has to do with aliens or anything with spiritualism or anything along those lines. And they always come up with a theory that does kind of make sense, but in my opinion, doesn't really. However, in these kinds of cases, none of the theories really make sense, I guess. I mean, they do if you believe in that kind of stuff, but you always have that question in your mind. But anyways, some people believe that maybe the men were robbed. Maybe this was some kind of setup. This was some kind of criminal thing, where these men had been in contact with other people who told them that they could get them in contact with aliens or extraterrestrial beings, and that they brought the men up to the hill and they gave them these capsules, which ended up being poisonous and killing them, and then they robbed the men of the $1,000 that they had on them and any other, personal belongings that might have been of value. Something that I just want to also add in here that I thought was very interesting is that another man was found in a similar state just a few months earlier on top of a hill in Brazil. He even had a lead mask on him just like these men. And so some people think that that is proof that this is some kind of criminal setup. But I also think that that could obviously be proof that more than these two men could have had contact with extraterrestrial beings, and maybe these beings told them, do something to cover your eyes. Something else to note is that the other man that I just mentioned was also an electrician. You guys are gonna have to let me know what you think of this case. I always find these ones that include aliens and things along those lines to be just absolutely fascinating, and I really lose myself in them. I love them. They're so fun to research and super, super interesting. But guys, that brings us to the end of today's video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.